Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I wish I could say that it's a pleasure, but the topic of our discussion is so unpleasant, so painful that it cannot be pleasurable to talk about it. It is, however, I think, necessary. I've worked on the topic or the topics of famine, of war crimes, mass atrocities, armed conflict, particularly in Northeast Africa, in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, since the mid-1980s. Also, I've worked in Rwanda and a few other places. I had thought that I could no longer be shocked by the scale of depravity and suffering, that I had seen it all. I was wrong. I think what we have seen in the last 12 months is something that stretches our credulity about the extent to which hatred can be a policy. I've written a book, I published a book recently on the history of famine and mass starvation, focusing on the way in which starvation has been used as an instrument of war and of policy around the world over the last 150 years. The only incidents that compare with what has been perpetrated in Tigray by the Ethiopian federal authorities, by the Eritrean forces, by the regional forces of Amhara. The only things that compare in scale, in gravity, and intent are episodes such as the genocide in Armenia during World War I and the Nazis' hunger plan on the Eastern Front during World War II. This surpasses what we have seen over the years in Somalia, in Ethiopia itself, in South Sudan, in Nigeria, even in Syria and in Yemen, I fear. Let me make 4 points. The first is that Tigray was poor before the war. Tigray was an area in which many people did not have a high standard of living, were food insecure. There were problems such as intermittent drought and locusts. Nonetheless, there had been nearly 30 years of economic development and a food security system put in place by the Ethiopian government that had reduced the risk of famine. They had not only reduced the risk of famine in Tigray, but throughout the country. The current Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Demeke Mekonnen, oversaw in 2015-2016 Ethiopia's largest ever famine response, with more than 10 million people being put on emergency relief in a very effective and rapid and very large scale emergency relief response. I think that would be the high point in Demeke's political career. He and others in the government know what it takes to prevent famine. They have done it. They know the vulnerabilities of the population to food insecurity. They have studied it. And therefore, to inflict the kind of deprivation and starvation on the population of Tigray that they have done over the last year was not an accident. It was something that they did deliberately. The fact that people were poor, and many of them were already close to hunger, is no excuse. It makes their decision to wage a war of starvation even more culpable. This war, this set of war crimes and crimes against humanity, has unfolded in 2 stages. The first stage was from November of last year until June of this year, when, as well as fighting a war against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the leadership there, and they had reasons for fighting that war. There was culpability on both sides for that war. But what is entirely one-sided in this war was the war of starvation waged against the people of Tigray. The systematic, widespread, relentless destruction of objects indispensable for survival of the civilian population. That is a war crime. That is the war crime of starvation. That included the destruction and rendering useless and looting of food, of harvests, of stored food, of commercial food, of food aid, the slaughter of oxen, the crushing beneath the boots of soldiers of even baby chicks. It included the destruction and rendering useless of health facilities, another object indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. The destruction of water facilities, many of them provided by aid organizations. We are all taxpayers to governments in the United States, in Europe, in the UK, etc. It is our tax money that paid for water schemes, agricultural schemes, and so on, that have been destroyed by the government that was supposedly a partner in development. We have seen the ethnic cleansing of the most productive areas of Tigray, Western Tigray, areas where people relied upon seasonal labor for their income. We have seen that the looting, the pillaging, the destruction of industries, of hotels, of all the sources of employment. We've seen the freezing of bank accounts, and the destruction of rural credit schemes, all of them indispensable for people to survive. And we have seen something else that I think will now become a part of the war crime of starvation, which is systematic rape and sexual violence against women and girls. The threat of rape has meant that women and girls are unable to undertake essential activities like traveling to market, like traveling to places where they might be able to obtain food. And those women and girls who are survivors of rape, often they are unable to care for themselves or for their children, and they face a life of sometimes of great physical disability and pain, and most often a life of being socially ostracized because of the conservative values of Tigrayan society. So because of no fault of their own, they are facing a life of poverty, deprivation, hunger, and their children too. Those crimes, that relentless campaign of crimes against the people of Tigray came for the most part to an end in June, when the Tigrayan resistance, its members driven to desperation by the cruelties inflicted on them and their families, took up arms and they drove out the Ethiopian National Defense Forces and the Eritrean forces from most of Tigray, not all of Tigray, most of Tigray. So the next phase in this campaign of starvation then came in, which was a complete comprehensive blockade, a blockade of humanitarian supplies over land and by air, and a blockade of essential commercial activities, trade, banking, and so on. The United Nations has estimated that approximately 100 trucks of food relief were needed every day to stop Tigray descending into large-scale famine. Something like 10% of that assistance has been provided. The Ethiopian government will tell us that it is conflict. It is armed conflict beyond the borders of Tigray, with the Tigray Defense Forces moving into neighboring regions, that is responsible for that. The Tigray Defense Forces in their offensives in Amhara and Afar regions certainly are responsible for many things. They are not responsible for blocking the aid. The main aid convoy route has not been a focus of fighting. And the only occasion on which armed conflict interrupted air supply was a few days ago when a UN humanitarian Air Services flight was forced not to land at Mekelle Airport because there was an air raid by the Ethiopian Air Force ongoing at the same time. Whatever criticism we may have of the government of Tigray, we cannot criticize it of obstructing aid. That is entirely the result of the Ethiopian government policy. And as a result, we are seeing the descent of Tigray relentlessly into a larger scale famine than we have seen for decades. The last point I want to make is about control over information. There is a history of Ethiopian governments concealing famine. Haile Selassie did so in 1973. He didn't create the famine, though his feudal system made it worse, but he covered it up. In 1984, the military government of Mengistu Haile Mariam created the famine through its counterinsurgency and then covered it up. But it allowed in BBC film crews almost exactly 37 years ago this week, and the world was disturbed by the images that it saw. The government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has been more relentless, consistent in denying access to journalists, to aid workers and the information that they may generate, to the United Nations and its systems than has ever been attempted in any comparable crisis in the contemporary world. We are simply not being given the information required for a formal designation of famine to be declared. We all know it is happening, but that information is being choked off. So the irony here is that over the decades, the international humanitarian agencies, the United Nations, the Western donors, have built up a highly professional system for determining the type of food crisis that may be occurring and designating it as humanitarian emergency or famine. But that very professional system is highly reliant on data. And when those data are not allowed to emerge, the international system is paralyzed. The UN has not declared a famine, even though the highest UN officials know that it is indeed happening. And the tragedy today is that not only are the international agencies, the UN Security Council, the African Union, apparently incapable of acting on their solemn commitments, the commitments enshrined in the United Nations Resolution 2417 on armed conflict and hunger, the commitments to prevent and prosecute crimes against humanity, war crimes and so on. Not only are they not acting on those, but they are not even taking the steps necessary to expose what is happening so that the conscience of the world is stirred to stop the innocent from dying. And I fear that we will only recognize the famine for what it is at some point when we get the chance, too late, to count the graves of the tens of thousands of children who I fear will have perished from starvation. Thank you.